cusp of the next wireless revolution, but as industry professionals, we must ask ourselves, what are the products and services that 5G architecture and infrastructure call for? To shed more light on the subject, may I please invite on stage the worldwide product and solution architect of network and digital services at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Swaminathan Venkataraman.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. This presentation is going to be a bit different. It's not going to be about backhaul or radio. We are going to talk about actually how IT-centric changes are happening within the standards and how the control plane is being defined and what sort of activities are happening and what should you be looking out for as these things evolve between release 15 from 3GPP and the release 16 that's going to come soon, right? So without further ado, let's start. So one of the first things that is interesting is if you look at this, this is probably reiterating what you guys heard right from the morning today. There are about predominantly 3 specific systems that are being talked about. In fact, the Honorable Minister mentioned it as a system of systems, which is pretty accurate in the sense that, you know, ITU and others are looking at it from 3 different perspectives of how to characterize this. Enhanced mobile broadband, you're talking about ultra low latency, reliable kind of use cases. We are talking about massive mission type communications. But behind all of this, to make this really go beyond a standard is about how you adopt these particular standards and to create a thriving ecosystem. So we talked about use cases, and use cases can only be realized if you have a fair degree of partnership between, you know, the operator, the telecom operator, the private industry, the enterprises, and so on and so forth. And we as vendors also are equally important there. But what is happening right now is that in these systems, we are beginning to see that we are moving away from having very telecom-centric protocols. There is a harmonization of protocols that is happening around HTTP, right, or web-based protocols that are more easily accessible and available to a lot of developers out there, right? So similarly, there is also going to be a fundamental change in how telecom operators will eventually procure, operate, manage these kind of systems. And cloud-native systems are coming to the fore. We are going beyond virtualization. We're actually talking about web scale. In fact, in the past 6 months, there is a lot of activity in defining actually what a web scale environment should look like, going beyond just network function virtualization. So it's a very interesting time to actually look at this from a service-based architecture perspective rather than actually only look at it from network function perspective alone. So we are beginning to define clear services that these network functions will provide, how these will be consumed, how they will interoperate, and how these services will actually be realized from a use case perspective, right? So not every use case out there, and we've been talking about what's relevant for India. What's relevant for India might not be relevant for other parts of the world and vice versa, right? But then how do you define these networks? How do you define these components? How do you define and make them work together? Is it one stack to rule everything? Or is it that you actually be able to provide a service-based architecture where you say, this is not a network function or an equipment anymore, this is actually a service that I need to include for realizing this particular use case. And what are those use cases? Those use cases could be related to, you know, something which actually can be characterized on how you want to address mobility, how do you want to address bandwidth, how do you want to address quality, and how frequently you use it, right? So depending on these, there are a lot of use cases that will be different. And not all use cases require all the same network functions. They do not need the same kind of network bandwidth. So why would you actually invest and run a network for smart metering at the same bandwidth, at the same frequency of use, like, for example, you know, robotic surgery that we are talking about? Doesn't make sense. So if we are able to rationalize, and if we are able to look at use cases that are relevant from a network perspective and only use those components that are required for running those services, then it becomes very interesting to plan evolution. So there is no revolution in this. 4G and other networks are here to stay. So there is going to be a period of adoption where you're going to have new radio, you're going to have simultaneous existence of the legacy networks as well. And it's very important to hide all of this behind an architecture that is no more based on functions, but based on services. And the standards are actually helping us to drive that. It did not happen, just like that. So many of you in the room probably, especially the telecom operators in the room, will probably already are members of NGMN. NGMN was the first to start defining the need for having something where you separate, service functions, network functions, and their service-based architectures. So if you keep this in mind, it will be very interesting to understand and rationalize whether I need a particular component or not as you build your architecture. Going beyond the spectrum, the backhaul, the radio, and stuff like that, it is about also looking at how the control plane functions will start looking like, whether they should be placed at the edge or they should be placed at a central location, will all now start coming into play as we look beyond actually looking at just the radio and so on, right? So in this case, this is a slide, this is actually a wake-up slide, no? All of us to wake up, right? But what it really is talking about is how NGMN started looking at initially how to simplify and create these kind of specific components that are required to run a particular use case, right? So if you look at network slicing, again, it's not important initially, right? So there is something that people can say that, oh, you know what, I can run this today. Absolutely fine. But as you plan ahead, when you start looking at, we were talking about private networks, we are talking about use case-based realization of 5G and so on. But then what does it really mean? It means that you need to be able to instantiate the right components, the right network functions that are required to actually do that particular functionality. Not every element will be required. So they are, for example, 3GPP defines an element called UDR, right, a data repository. It defines something called as, let us say, a UDM, which is actually a next level of IHSS and so on. So in that case, you should start thinking about what network functions are needed. As network operators or telecom operators, it becomes interesting to see, can I do best of breed rather than actually do one full stack? So it throws up a lot of possibilities the minute you start thinking about service-based architecture rather than looking at, end-to-end stacks. So in this case, the interesting part was, where do I bring the simplification? Where do I bring the ability to adopt more easily? Again, do not want to go into the technical details of it, but having a web-based protocol and offering it up to actually an application is far easier than offering a network-centric protocol like Diameter, for example. I think this is common sense. It's nothing to do with technology itself. So being able to do that, and 3GPP is doing that currently in release 15, which just got ratified recently, we actually have the beginnings of a complete service-based definition of what network functions are, what services and reference points. There are no more reference points alone, because if you look at previously they were just reference points. Now you begin to see actual services, actual APIs that can be offered up. So it's very interesting as we see we are in a very, very important phase right now. It all started with an NGMN white paper. If you have not read it, definitely go ahead, take a look at the NGMN white paper. There are a lot of white papers out there, but this one is very interesting because it starts the thinking, and it is something not done by vendors, not done by standards, it's done by a consortium of telecom operators, which is why it is very interesting. So if you take a look at that paper, it starts thinking, it starts offering up, perspectives on how a service-based architecture should look like. We now have the 3GPP release 15, and we are now waiting for release 16. Release 15 didn't talk about cellular IoT, didn't talk about ultra-reliable, low-latency stuff, but in release 16, it will start talking about that. Very interesting stuff that is happening is that within the industry, we are now talking about microservices at the network level, which never happened before. We are talking about containers at the network level. We are talking about how this will be managed. So in this diagram, the takeaway that you should have from this diagram is not about all of this, but the fact that every network function out there, the blobs that you see called NEF, UDM, and so on and so forth, all these will now become microservices. And what is microservices? A very simple analogy, right? So you could think of it like the famous cloud metaphor that keeps coming up, right? It is pets versus cattle, right? Before, if it is a pet, if a pet falls sick, what do you do? What do you do when a pet falls sick? you actually nurse it back to health, right? You actually take it to a doctor, you nurse it back to health. But if you think about these things as cattle now, if a cattle actually one of them dies, you just buy one more, right? So it becomes very interesting from that perspective that until now, all these functions that you are seeing from an architectural point of view look like pets. You need to nurse them back. You need to actually, invest time in them. Think about an infrastructure that goes beyond this and looks at it like cattle. One goes down automatically through an automated procedure, you bring another one up. Now, how is that possible? It's not possible with the current level of thinking. You need to move away from the virtualization mentality that exists to actually a cloud-native mentality. And this is what is a big change that is happening. Service-based architecture is driven by the fact that control plane has completely been separated from the user plane, and you are beginning to look at cloud-native way of defining stateless, ephemeral containers for your network. And this is happening. There are POCs that are being driven by operators around the world, and it's just a matter of time when others actually start doing this as well. So to help basically do all of this, 3GPP is defining some new network elements, like for example, separating the UDR and from the UDM, being able to actually add structured and unstructured data exposure to be able to bring a network exposure function, which is actually an evolution of the SCEF, if you know what is the SCEF, which predominantly was only for the narrowband IoT stuff. But network exposure functions start to actually lay the foundation of how you would bring those innovative ecosystems to do those POCs, to build those applications. Because without those applications, we are still talking about how to do things better, right? It's just a better mousetrap, actually. When there is no mouse, then there is no point in having a better mousetrap. So you need to have those functions to be able to actually bring those applications that can easily then communicate with this network. So service-based interface means that you are bringing all the cloud-native philosophies as well in terms of discovery. There is a new function that 3GPP defines called as network resource function, where actually then you will be able to discover multi-vendor, best-of-breed network functions that can actually make up your slice. So it's a very interesting space to be in with respect to how operators will now in the future, I don't know how far in the future, but in the future will actually be able to procure, manage, and operate networks in a very different manner if that maturity exists. Similarly, this diagram is to just show two important inflection points. One is the ability to actually manage all this data that is going to come in, right? And to be able to have the right kind of data functions which are able to provide you with the right subscriber data as we converge, right? This is not, from day one, you're not going to have just standalone deployments of 5G. As we've been talking from the morning, it's going to coexist. There is going to be, deployments that will actually merge both of them. In fact, around the world, a pattern that we have seen is operators beginning to actually look at clusters of functionality that are similar between 4G, 5G, and so on and so forth, right? Which means that as we go forward, then we will be able to look at these things in a way where clusters will be common between 4G and 5G. And two important factors here is, one is the ability to expose these APIs to bring those ecosystems. The other is to be able to have the right data fundamentals to be able to manage both structured and unstructured data. I'll skip this one and leave you with a final word on this, is that it is very important for all of us in this room, including we from, for example, HP Enterprise or for that matter, telecom operators, and also the enterprises at large who will become beneficiaries of 5G, to make sure we succeed together. And one of the case in point examples that I can throw up is that we had the opportunity to work with Deutsche Telekom. And it was a very interesting POC that we did, where we actually built the shared data environment for them, and where Deutsche Telekom built the PCRF, the policy control function, to be able to actually integrate with this shared data environment to drive meaningful outcomes from the proof of concept. In fact, what is very heartening for us to see is that Deutsche Telekom was awarded a policy control award for actually having the most innovative data monetization solution. So it is very interesting time for us, especially as IT-centric IT-centric practices and IT-centric technology can actually be applied to network functions, and how 5G actually can be really procured, operated, and then finally monetized as new use cases come in through a journey that is more an evolution rather than a revolution. So thank you for the opportunity, and have a good session ahead. Thank you.